Welcome to your deep dive. Today we're going deep into the BP Macondo oil spill
Well, yes.
of 2010, a story of engineering marvels and human error, and really the complex relationship between industry and government oversight.
Yeah,
You've given us some fascinating sources here,
absolutely.
excerpts from a Harvard Business School case study,
Okay.
President Obama's Oval Office address, and some really eye-opening reports.
Wow.
So get ready for some surprising facts about deepwater drilling and buckle up because we're about to uncover the chain of events that led to the largest offshore oil spill in U.S. history.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how a project that seemed nearly complete could suddenly turn into chaos.
Right.
We'll examine the causes of the explosion, the response efforts, both the successful and not so successful,
Yeah.
and the regulatory landscape that shaped the entire event.
Okay, so before we get to the explosion itself, can you kind of set the scene for us? Like, what was the deepwater oil scene like back then?
Yeah, so, back then, deepwater drilling was seen as kind of the future of oil exploration. A
Okay.
huge opportunity. And BP was really a leader in the field.
Wow, so they were kind of at the forefront of all this.
Yeah, they were really pushing the boundaries of what was possible.
And all this was happening a mile beneath the surface of the ocean.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible when you think about the engineering challenges involved.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So from what I was reading, it seemed like this was a really complex operation that relied heavily on outside contractors.
Oh, absolutely. The Deepwater Horizon rig, for example, that was actually owned and operated by Transocean,
Okay.
not BP directly.
So BP wasn't actually running the show.
Well, they were ultimately responsible for the well.
Right.
But yeah, they relied on these specialized contractors for a lot of the actual work.
And I imagine that division of labor probably had some pretty big implications.
Oh, yeah, for sure. When something goes wrong, it can get really complicated to figure out who's responsible.
And who's accountable?
Exactly, and that was definitely a factor in the Macondo spill.
So let's talk about the government's role in all of this.
Okay.
The Minerals Management Service, or MMS,
Yeah, the MMS.
they were the government agency responsible for overseeing all of this offshore drilling.
Right, they were supposed to be the watchdogs.
But it sounds like there was some problems there.
Yeah, there were some serious issues with the MMS.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, they were chronically understaffed,
Really?
and they had a history of, kind of lax enforcement.
Interesting.
Some reports even suggested that there was a culture of complacency within the agency
Oh.
and even close ties with the oil industry.
So maybe not the best recipe for effective oversight.
No, not really. It seems like they were more focused on promoting offshore drilling than on actually regulating it.
Which, I guess makes sense, given that they were also in charge of collecting royalties from oil and gas production.
Right. It was kind of a conflict of interest.
So you have this agency that's supposed to be protecting the public interest, but they're also incentivized to promote the industry they're regulating.
Exactly. And that created some real problems.
So all of this is happening in the background as BP is pushing ahead with this ambitious deepwater drilling project.
Right.
And then it's April 20th, 2010. The Deepwater Horizon is in the final stages of drilling the Macondo well, and then boom, an explosion rocks the rig.
It was a terrifying moment for the workers on board.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, it must have been absolutely chaotic.
I read that 11 workers tragically lost their lives,
Yeah, it was a devastating loss.
and 17 others were injured.
It was a really dark day for the industry.
And meanwhile, almost a mile beneath the surface, oil starts gushing into the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, it was the beginning of what would become the worst oil spill in U.S. history.
So what exactly caused the explosion?
Well, the exact causes are still debated today, but it seems like there were several factors that contributed to it.
Like-
One key decision was to replace the heavy drilling mud with lighter seawater.
Okay.
And that may have destabilized the well.
Why would they do that?
Well, it was probably a cost-saving measure.
Yeah.
Drilling mud is expensive and seawater is readily available.
Makes sense. But it sounds like a risky move.
It definitely was.
Yeah.
And then there were also potential issues with the cementing of the well.
The cementing?
Yeah, the cement is supposed to seal off the well and prevent leaks.
Oh, okay.
But it seems like there may have been problems with how the cement was applied.
So these were kind of warning signs then.
Yeah, you could say that.
And then there was this thing called the blowout preventer.
Oh, yeah, the BOP. That was
Yeah.
a crucial piece of equipment.
So what exactly is a blowout preventer?
Well, it's a massive device
Okay.
that sits on the seafloor, and it's designed to close off the well in case of an emergency.
So it's like the last line of defense.
Exactly. It has multiple redundant systems,
Okay.
so it's supposed to be extremely reliable, but for some reason it didn't work at the Macondo well.
So the BOP failing was basically the immediate cause of the oil spill.
Yeah, you could say that.
But it sounds like there were a lot of other issues leading up to that point.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It wasn't just one thing that went wrong. It was a whole series of events and decisions.
Okay, so let's talk about BP's safety record.
All right.
Because from the sources you provided, it seems like they had some issues even before the Macondo spill.
Yeah, BP's safety record was definitely not spotless.
Okay.
There were a number of incidents that raised red flags.
Like what?
Well, there was a massive explosion at BP's Texas City refinery in 2005
Wow.
that killed 15 people.
Oh my gosh.
And investigations found that there were major safety deficiencies at the refinery.
So this wasn't just a one-off thing.
No, it seemed to be a pattern.
Okay.
There were also reports of budget cuts, worker fatigue,
Oh no.
and a culture that discouraged reporting safety concerns.
Wow, so like people were afraid to speak up?
Yeah, exactly.
That's not good.
No, not at all. It creates a really dangerous environment.
So we have the Macondo well, which was already behind schedule and over budget.
Right.
And then there were these unusual pressure readings that were reported.
Yeah, there were definitely signs that something wasn't right.
And one engineer even called it a nightmare well.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong indication that there were serious concerns.
So knowing all of this,
Yeah.
why do you think BP continued drilling?
That's a good question. The sources don't explicitly say why they continued,
Okay.
but it's possible that they were under a lot of pressure to finish the well,
Right.
especially given the rising costs and delays.
Okay.
They may have also just underestimated the risks involved.
Or maybe they were overconfident.
Yeah, that's possible too.
It's like they had all these warning signs, but they just kept pushing forward.
It's a classic case of what can go wrong when safety takes a backseat to profit.
Yeah. It's a tragic reminder that sometimes the most important lessons are learned the hard way.
Absolutely.
So it seems like there were multiple points where alarm bells should have been ringing.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But for whatever reason, those alarms were either ignored or dismissed.
And that ultimately led to a disaster of epic proportions.
And the question of whether this was a tragic accident
Right.
or a disaster waiting to happen,
Yeah.
that's crucial. I mean,
Right.
it seems like there were both technical failures and human decisions that contributed to the event.
Absolutely. It's a complex story with a lot of different layers.
Let's unpack those layers, because I think there's a lot more to learn here.
I agree.
And I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear more about how this all unfolded.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive deeper.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, so in the wake of this explosion, there was understandably a lot of finger pointing going on.
Right.
BP tried to shift some of the blame onto Halliburton,
Okay.
which was the contractor responsible for cementing the well.
So like a classic case of passing the buck.
Yeah, kind of. But, to be fair, the cementing of the well was a really critical factor.
Okay.
Halliburton argued that BP's choices,
Okay.
like using too few centralizers.
Centralizers.
Yeah, these are devices that help ensure the cement is properly placed around the well bore.
Oh.
So basically they were saying that BP's decisions could have led to cementing failures.
Interesting. So Halliburton's basically saying, hey, we did our job. It was BP's fault.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah.
They also claimed that they had raised concerns about the cementing job,
Okay.
but were ultimately overruled by BP.
So it's kind of a he said, she said situation.
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure who was ultimately responsible,
Right.
but it's clear that the cementing of the well was a major factor in the disaster.
And all of this is happening as the oil is spreading, the media is all over it, and President Obama is under immense pressure to act.
Absolutely. This is a huge political crisis for the Obama administration.
Yeah, I mean, this was not long after he had announced plans to expand offshore drilling.
Right.
So he was facing a lot of criticism for that decision.
Yeah, a lot of people were saying that he had been too quick to embrace offshore drilling.
And now this disaster was happening on his watch.
Exactly. He needed to show that he was taking the situation seriously.
So what steps did the government take?
Well, in June 2010, Obama addressed the nation from the Oval Office.
Okay.
It was a pretty significant moment. He laid out a 3-part plan.
What was that?
First, contain and clean up the oil.
Okay.
Second, help the Gulf Coast and its people recover.
Right.
And third, prevent this kind of disaster from happening again.
Makes sense.
He also announced a 6-month moratorium on deep water drilling,
Okay.
pending investigations and safety reviews.
So he was basically hitting the pause button on offshore drilling?
Yeah, he wanted to make sure that something like this wouldn't happen again.
Okay.
And he also stressed the need to hold BP accountable for the damage.
It sounds like he was trying to project a sense of control.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
He wanted to reassure the American public that the government was on top of the situation.
But how do you stop an oil spill that's happening a mile beneath the surface of the ocean?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Well, actually more like the billion-dollar question in this case.
Yeah, you're right about that.
You mentioned earlier that BP tried using a containment dome.
Right. They tried to place this massive dome over the wellhead to capture the oil.
Okay.
It had worked in shallower waters.
Okay.
But the depth and the pressure at the Macondo well presented some huge challenges.
And then there was this issue with hydrates, right?
Yeah, hydrates. These are icy crystals that form under high pressure and low temperatures.
Oh, wow.
And they can really complicate deep water drilling operations.
So the cold temperatures at that depth caused a buildup of these hydrates.
Exactly, and they ended up blocking the dome.
So the dome didn't work.
No, it was a setback for sure.
So what did they try next?
Well, their next attempt was a procedure called top kill.
Top kill.
Yeah, they tried to plug the leaking pipe by injecting heavy mud and other materials into it.
Kind of like trying to clog a drain?
Yeah, kind of. But unfortunately, it didn't work either.
Man, so they're like 0 for 2 at this point.
Yeah, it was not looking good.
So all the while, the oil is still gushing out.
Right. Millions of gallons of oil are flowing into the Gulf of Mexico every day.
And the media is reporting on every setback.
Oh, yeah. The pressure was on.
Public anger is growing.
And BP's CEO, Tony Hayward.
Oh, yeah. What about him?
He wasn't exactly helping the situation.
What do you mean?
Well, he made some pretty insensitive comments.
Like what?
Well, there was that infamous, "I'd like my life back" comment.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It was widely seen as tone-deaf and insensitive.
Yeah. I mean, considering the massive scale of the disaster and its impact on people's lives and livelihoods.
Exactly. It was a major PR blunder.
It sounds like he was just really out of touch with the situation.
Yeah, it definitely seemed that way.
So amidst all of this chaos and finger-pointing, BP is also drilling a relief well.
Right. That was their long-term solution.
So can you explain what a relief well is?
Sure. It's basically a backup well
Okay.
that's drilled to intersect the original well.
Okay.
It's a complex and time-consuming process.
How long does it take?
It can take months. Yeah, it depends on the depth of the well and the geological conditions.
So they're basically drilling diagonally from a safe distance
Right.
until they intercept the original well bore.
Exactly. And then they pump in cement to permanently seal it.
It sounds incredibly challenging. Like performing surgery a mile beneath the ocean?
It is. It's a remarkable feat of engineering.
But it takes time. And time was not on BP's side.
No, it wasn't. The oil was still spilling and the pressure was mounting.
So in June 2010, President Obama met with BP executives at the White House.
Yeah, it was a highly charged meeting.
I bet. What came out of that meeting?
Well, BP agreed to establish a $20 billion escrow fund.
$20 billion.
Yeah, it was a huge sum of money.
And what was that money for?
It was to compensate victims of the spill.
Wow.
It was a major victory for the Obama administration.
So that $20 billion was intended to cover a wide range of claims.
Right, everything from economic losses
Okay.
to property damage to health impacts.
So how did they decide who was eligible for compensation and how much each person would receive?
That was a massive undertaking. They brought in Kenneth Feinberg.
Kenneth Feinberg.
Yeah, he was a well-known lawyer who had experience handling complex compensation programs.
Okay.
He had previously administered the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund.
Oh, wow. So he was definitely the right man for the job.
Yeah, he was well-equipped to deal with the legal and ethical complexities of this situation.
So Feinberg's task was not easy.
No, not at all. Determining who should be compensated and for how much is always a sensitive issue.
Right.
And in this case, it was especially complicated.
Because of the scale of the disaster.
Exactly. And also because of the geographic scope of the impacts.
What do you mean by geographic scope?
Well, the oil spill affected people in multiple states.
Okay.
Not just those who lived right on the coast.
Right. So how did Feinberg approach this challenge?
Well, he created a system that prioritized those who were closest to the spill
Okay.
and those who were in industries that were directly affected.
Like fishing and tourism?
Exactly. But he also recognized that the economic impacts of the spill could extend far beyond the immediate area.
Okay.
So he tried to create a system that was both fair and efficient.
It sounds like striking that balance, being fair to those who are most affected, but also acknowledging the broader economic ripple effects.
Yeah, it was a tough job.
So did everyone agree with Feinberg's approach?
Well, there was some pushback.
Really?
Yeah, some people felt that the criteria were too restrictive,
Okay.
while others argued that he was being too generous.
Hmm.
But ultimately, Feinberg had to make tough decisions based on the available information
Right.
and the mandate he was given.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We talked about the failed containment attempts,
Right.
the political fallout,
Uh-huh.
and the efforts to compensate victims.
Yeah, it's been a long and winding road.
Did BP ever manage to stop the flow of oil?
Yes, they did.
And what happened to Tony Hayward after his infamous comment? So we left off with BP really struggling to contain the well and facing this like intense scrutiny over how they were handling everything. Did they ever manage to stop the oil flow?
They did, after 87 days.
87 days.
Yeah, 87 agonizing days. They finally capped the well in mid-July.
Oh my gosh.
They used a new blowout preventer stacked on top of the one that had failed.
Oh wow.
And then they pumped cement down to permanently seal the well.
Wow, what a relief that must have been.
Oh, yeah. At least to stop that oil gushing out.
But I imagine the story doesn't end there.
No, not at all. I mean, the aftermath of this spill was incredibly complex.
Yeah.
Far-reaching BP-faced lawsuits,
Right.
government investigations, just a complete PR nightmare
Yeah.
that really tarnished their reputation.
It seems like Tony Hayward's wish was kind of granted,
Oh, yeah.
but not in the way he intended.
Right. He didn't last long as a CEO. After that, "I'd like my life back" comment.
Yeah, he's replaced by Robert Dudley.
Yeah, Robert Dudley, he was BP's first American CEO.
Oh, that's interesting.
And the company, they had to sell off assets, suspend dividend payments.
Yeah.
Just to try to cover the immense costs of this spill.
So cleanup compensation fines.
Everything, yeah.
So what about the environmental impact?
Yeah.
Was it as bad as everyone initially feared?
So the impact was severe, but thankfully it was less catastrophic than some of those early predictions,
Okay.
especially compared to the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska.
Okay.
There were a few factors that contributed to this.
Okay, like what?
Well, the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico helped break down the oil more quickly.
Okay.
And the type of oil that spilled it was lighter and less viscous than some other types.
Oh, okay. So it was a little bit of luck amidst this tragedy.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
And the currents in the Gulf, they helped disperse the oil somewhat.
But there were still significant impacts there, right?
Oh, absolutely. There was extensive damage to marine life, coastal ecosystems.
Right.
Industries like fishing and tourism really suffered.
Yeah. And those long-term consequences are probably still being studied.
They are, yeah. We know that the spill had profound effects on the Gulf ecosystem, but the full extent of the damage may not be known for years to come.
And of course, we can't forget the human cost.
Absolutely.
11 lives lost in the explosion.
Right.
Countless livelihoods disrupted.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the environmental impact.
Right.
But we can't forget about the people whose lives were turned upside down by this disaster.
You know, and it really was a wake-up call about the risks of deepwater drilling.
Yeah.
And just the need for robust oversight.
It really highlighted the importance of having strong regulations and a competent agency to enforce them.
Speaking of which, the MMS, they were the agency that was supposed to be regulating offshore drilling.
Right.
Earlier, you mentioned they were understaffed.
Yeah.
Had a history of kind of being lax with enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to them after the spill?
Well, they faced intense criticism for their role in the disaster.
Yeah.
Investigations revealed this really cozy relationship between the MMS and the oil industry. Some employees were even accepting gifts from the companies they were supposed to be regulating.
Wow, that's a major conflict of interest.
Yeah, it was a big scandal.
So what happened?
Well, the Obama administration, they responded by restructuring the MMS.
Oh.
They broke it up into 3 separate agencies.
Oh, wow.
To avoid those conflicts of interest.
So one agency would focus on collecting royalties from oil and gas production,
Right.
another on leasing federal lands and waters for energy development,
Mm-hmm.
and the third on safety and environmental enforcement.
Exactly. They wanted to create a clearer separation of powers and increase accountability.
But did those reforms go far enough?
That's a question that's still debated today.
Right.
Some people argue that the reforms didn't address the fundamental issues,
Right.
the inherent risks of deep water drilling.
Yeah.
Others believe that the industry can operate safely with proper oversight.
Okay.
The Macondo spill definitely fueled that whole debate about our reliance on fossil fuels
Right.
and the trade-offs we make for energy.
Speaking of trade-offs, you mentioned earlier that companies could avoid royalty payments on some deep water drilling.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. At the time, there were these royalty relief programs
Oh, okay.
that exempted companies from paying royalties on a certain portion of their deepwater production.
Interesting.
This was meant to encourage investment in deepwater exploration.
Okay.
But some critics argued that it was basically a giveaway to the industry
Right.
at the expense of taxpayers.
So it seems like there's always this tension
Yeah,
between economic interests and environmental protection.
absolutely. It's a delicate balance.
And then there's the issue of liability
Right.
from the sources you provided. I learned that after the Exxon Valdez spill, Congress capped the amount that companies could be held liable for in an offshore spill.
Yeah, that's right. The Oil Pollution Act of 1990 capped liability at $75 million.
$75 million.
Which, in the grand scheme of things, is a pittance compared to the actual costs of the Macondo spill. After the spill, there were calls to raise that cap, but it ultimately remained unchanged.
So even after this devastating disaster, the law protecting these oil companies from paying the full cost of their actions remained in effect.
Yeah, it's a pretty controversial issue.
It makes you wonder, what if deep-water drilling had never been allowed in the first place?
That is a fascinating question to consider.
Right.
Would we have seen the same level of innovation and investment in renewable energy?
Yeah, would we be less reliant on fossil fuels today?
It's impossible to know for sure,
Right.
but it definitely highlights those difficult choices we face as a society.
Right.
When it comes to balancing energy needs, economic interests, and environmental protection.
Well said. You know, this deep dive, it only scratched the surface.
It did.
But hopefully it sparked some curiosity for our listeners
Yeah, I hope so.
to learn more about this complex and important event.
There's definitely a lot more to explore.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.